James Patrick McKenna was 27. He came from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He grew up on a farm. He knew tractors and stubborn engines. He could fix a broken axle before breakfast. He had 3 brothers and 1 sister. He hated small talk. He liked things that fit together: bolts, gears, tolerances. He liked the smell of hot metal. He enlisted in 1941. He shipped out in early 1942. He trained as an aircraft mechanic. He learned the P-51 like a Bible. He learned its quirks the way a farmer learns his plow. He earned the rank of technical sergeant. He slept in a cot and kept his tools in a wooden box. He wrote home twice a month. He sent money when he could. He kept his letters short. He had been at Dobodura for 6 weeks. The squadron had arrived in late June. The airfield was rough and hot. Mosquitoes bit until dawn. Nights smelled of diesel and wet canvas. They flew daily, sometimes twice. The P-51s were new to the theater. Pilots loved their speed. Mechanics hated their surprises. McKenna had seen engines surge, instruments fail, and hoses split. He had seen men walk away. He had also seen men die. The squadron had little time for ceremony. They fixed planes and sent them back up. McKenna worked long shifts. He watched pilots kiss Lucky Charms and then climb into cockpits. He watched them wave and taxi and disappear into the steam of the runway. He kept the fishhooks and coffee and prayer notes in his pocket. He kept a list in his head. There was a fatal problem. It was small. It was simple on paper. And it was killing pilots. The P-51's drop tank jettison mechanism sometimes failed to release cleanly at high speed. The tank would hang at an angle. That angle made a violent yaw. The plane would snap into an unrecoverable spin. Pilots hit the jungle or the ocean. The wrecks were always sudden. No time to radio. No time to pray. McKenna first noticed the risk after a late night maintenance check. He felt a slack in the release detent. He mentioned it to Lieutenant Hayes. Hayes laughed it off. "They'll fix it at depot," Hayes said. They didn't. The detent stayed. The list of names grew. The first man was Corporal Walt Jensen, 24, from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. He had been a ball turret mechanic 3 years earlier and had liked boxing. He volunteered for flight duty when the P-51s arrived. He wanted to see the sky. On July 3, 1943, at 10:14 a.m., Jensen took off with a full drop tank. He was assigned to escort. 15 minutes into the mission, his tank failed to jettison cleanly during a high-speed roll. Witnesses heard an odd thump over the radio, then a scream of wind. Jensen's Mustang rolled. It fell like a stone. His parachute never opened. McKenna had been in the hangar when the radio crackled the call. He remembered Jensen's mother writing letters about his boxing gloves. McKenna felt sick. He had fixed Jensen's oil line 2 days earlier. The image of Jensen's grin haunted him for nights. The second was Sergeant Miguel Mike Alvarez, age 21, from Los Angeles, California. He had been a taxi driver before the war. He loved jazz and bad coffee. On July 19, 1943, he and his wingman engaged a pair of Zeros. They dove at 320 miles per hour. Alvarez squeezed the toggle to jettison. The tank popped free, almost. It tilted and slapped the right tailplane. The Mustang yawed hard. Radio transmissions went frantic. The wingman watched helplessly as Miguel fought the controls. He called for help. Nothing came. The plane cartwheeled into the jungle. Alvarez's mother received the telegram 3 weeks later. McKenna learned the pilot's name because Miguel had tuned the squadron radio to do a bad joke for everyone. McKenna had once shared a cigarette with him. Both deaths changed the crew. They were not statistics. They were faces on the mess table. Both had full names on the board. Both had exact times of loss. They had families. They had small human details, Jensen's gloves and Alvarez's bad coffee. McKenna wrote their names on the inside of his toolbox. He performed small rituals. He tightened bolts longer than necessary. He checked the jettison catches twice. Each death added urgency. Each death made the handshake between pilot and mechanic more solemn. It made McKenna look at the release mechanism with hatred. He studied diagrams. He watched flights. He listened to radio chatter. He began to keep a private log. It had names and dates, and a single word after each: Jettison. The problem felt deliberate in the way only repeated failures can. It felt like a design flaw with a conscience. The list kept growing. McKenna's sleep grew thin. He dreamed of tanks swinging like pendulums. He woke with grease in his hair and panic in his throat. Hayes joked about superstition. He rolled cigarettes from an old pack and handed one to McKenna. "You worry too much," Hayes said. McKenna nodded. He could not shake the image of a tank catching the airflow and slamming a tail. He knew the plane. He knew physics. He had a hunch. It was one thing to be a mechanic. It was another to stand by while men died for a problem he could fix. The P-51's drop tank was a simple thing. A cylindrical belly tank held fuel for long escorts. It attached under the fuselage with a latch assembly. In theory, the pilot flipped a switch. A piston would pull a detent as. The tank would fall away clean. In practice, things were messier. At high speeds, the airflow under the plane was violent. The tank caught turbulent eddies. If the detent did not release sharply, the tank would pivot on the remaining catch. That pivot changed the center of pressure in a flash. The plane yaws. The yaw, at certain speeds and angles of attack, created an instantaneous stall on one wing. There wasn't a second to correct. A stall at 320 miles per hour is not the slow, recoverable stall a training field teaches. It is a violent rotation that rips wings and snaps control rods. Pilots called it the drop spin. Mechanically, the problem came down to tolerances. The detent had a little hook and a spring-loaded plunger. Dirt, a hairline bend, a worn radius. Any of these could add friction. The design accepted a small amount of friction within specifications. Those words began to taste like ash to McKenna. Within specifications meant engineers had signed off. It meant the manuals listed acceptable play. Those margins did not account for tropical grime, salt, and combat vibration. Why would officials refuse to fix it? Bureaucracy is not cruelty. It is paperwork, studies, approvals, and time. The manufacturing line said the part met spec. The depot claimed the field units handled attachment variation. The engineers argued they could not launch a design change without testing and recertification. The safety office said the numbers did not show a systemic defect. The numbers they used excluded missions in New Guinea and ignored environmental wear. Field modifications were verboten. A mechanic who altered flight controls or release mechanisms technically risked a court-martial. There were forms to fill, affidavits, and supply requisitions. A temporary field solution required authorization from wing headquarters. Authorization might take weeks. Weeks in war are many lives. There was also pride. Engineers defended their designs. Pilots trusted manuals. Command trusted paperwork. To admit a design fault meant recalls, blame, and disruption. The chain of command would rather attribute losses to pilot error or to weather. They would rather log a non-combat accident in a ledger and move on. McKenna understood all this. He sat in meetings and watched men quote paragraphs. He saw the hands of officers tighten around cigars when they talked about fleet modifications. It was safer, politically, to keep the system as it was. It was cheaper, administratively, to accept attrition. Those truths made McKenna angrier than fear. He began to test small changes in secret. He would not alter control surfaces. He would not touch anything that might be noticed on inspection. He looked at the release detent as a human problem. If the detent sometimes hesitated, what could force it clean at the critical moment? He tried shims and grease, Grease helped in the shop but hardened in the cold of altitude. Shims slipped. He needed something that would guarantee a crisp snap, but be simple, reversible, and small enough to hide. The solution had to be stupidly obvious. It had to be something a man could carry in his pocket. It had to be something that did not require requisition forms or engineering blueprints. It had to be something that took less than 10 minutes to install. The third casualty was Lieutenant Patrick O'Rourke, 26, from Boston, Massac. USETS. O'Rourke had been a petroleum engineer before the war. He loved fast cars and cursed like a sailor. On August 2, 1943, at 09:06 a.m., O'Rourke took off as part of a sweep. Radio logs show sharp, clipped transmissions. "Tank stuck. Can't." Then static. Later wreckage found at the foot of a ridge confirmed a hard impact. Witnesses from another squadron recorded a slapping noise over radio. A tank had apparently struck the elevator. The Mustang pitched down and dove into trees. O'Rourke's parachute was found tangled. He left behind a fiancée and a dog named Buttons. McKenna had admired O'Rourke for his habit of sharpening pencils to a point and writing undermanned letters. He took O'Rourke's death personally. More pilots began to die. The pattern took shape. 37 P-51s lost in 6 weeks was a number whispered in the maintenance tents. That statistic might have been exaggerated in the mess, but the pattern was real. Planes were lost during high-speed maneuvers or immediately after attempting to drop tanks. The logs compiled by squadrons showed discrepancies. Loss during jettison or loss following abnormal yaw. But those entries were scattered across units and buried in reports. McKenna mapped them on a scrap of oilcloth. He wrote names and dates. He drew little crosses where the wreckage fell. The map looked like a rash. He compared serial numbers and maintenance logs. He dug through crates for old memos. He watched a pattern emerge. The failures were not random. They clustered around long-range escort missions where pilots were pushing speed and turning hard. The squadron's senior officers refused to see the map. They saw records and forms. They saw nothing official. McKenna showed his tape measure and his calipers to a deputy maintenance officer. The officer nodded slowly and said that the part was within factory tolerance. Within tolerance was an acceptable answer. It allowed operations to continue. It shrugged off losses as cost of war. McKenna's frustration deepened. He could fix this. He could keep men alive. He worked nights, tinkering with release catches. He made diagrams. He explained the aerodynamic consequences to Hayes, who listened with a soldier's impatience. Hayes said, "If you think you can fix it, do it. But don't get us both court-martialed." McKenna agreed. He needed silence. He needed an idea. The breaking point came quietly. There was no dramatic scene, just a letter. A telegram slid under the sergeant's bunk announcing the death of another pilot. Sergeant William Bill Carter, age 22, from Dayton, Ohio. Carter's Mustang had stalled immediately after drop. The radio had caught the tail end of a scream. Carter had been due home in November. McKenna read the telegram twice. He folded it and slid it into his toolbox. He decided not to do the paperwork. He decided to act. He knew the physics. He knew where the detent stuck. He knew a piece of metal, bent and shoved in the right place, could eliminate the hesitation. He knew a 6-inch length of piano wire, stiff, springy, and thin, would hold a detent open until the pilot deliberately released the latch, ensuring a clean separation. If installed correctly, it would prevent partial release. It would not add weight or complexity. It would be removable in a minute. It would not show up on inspection if hidden. But the risk was enormous. If the wire slipped, if it fouled moving parts, if it jammed, the whole plane could lose its belly tank forever, and possibly rip open the fuselage. Worse, if discovered, McKenna faced a court-martial. If it failed in flight, men could die and blame him. The risk lived in his chest like a hot coal. He also knew waiting for permission was a different kind of death. Permission would not come until many more names were on telegrams. He thought of Jensen's gloves and Alvarez's laugh and O'Rourke's pencils. He opened his toolbox. He wrapped the piano wire around his finger and felt its resilience. He packed it into his pocket. He had decided. The final straw came at dusk. The airfield smelled of wet canvas and frying meat. The pilots were at the mess. Hayes came in late. His hands trembled. He had a scowl that morning that couldn't be washed away. Hayes sat across from McKenna and asked quietly, "Is there anything you can do?" Hayes's voice was small in the dining tent. Around them, men laughed at a radio joke. Hayes stared at his fingers. "Ain't much to say," he muttered. "They say the release is fine, but I can't shake it. I saw Walt go down." He looked up. There was desperation in his eyes. McKenna recognized it. He had seen it on pilots before a mission, the look of a man who understood risk and wanted less of it. McKenna replied, "Maybe." He said it like a promise. He did not offer plans. He did not concoct theories. He simply said he would try. Hayes left at dawn to brief. He tucked a photograph of his sister into his flight jacket. McKenna watched the way he folded his hands around the picture. It made the decision clearer. McKenna weighed consequences. He pictured form boards and the legal sergeant's grim smile. He imagined his mother in Cedar Rapids receiving a telegram. He imagined prison stripes. He imagined being the story of how a man broke the rules to save men and was punished for it. He reminded himself that living to be punished was better than dead and unexplained. He made a rule. He would not change structural components. He would not alter flight controls. He would not remove safety wires on control rods. He would design a temporary, reversible fix. He would test it on ground runs. He would trust his hands and his calipers. And if it worked, he would only apply it to aircraft with pilots who personally asked for it. He would not volunteer planes without consent. At 11:30 p.m., the field lights were dim. McKenna slipped out of the tent with a toolbox and a small parcel. He walked to Hayes' Mustang. He crouched under the left wing. He felt the night air sticky on his skin. He felt the plane's warmth after a day's run. He slid beneath the belly and stared at the release assembly. Moonlight picked out grease. He counted the screws and the play in the detent. He took a breath. The modification scene was a study in blunt terror. McKenna worked alone. His flashlight threw long shadows. Mosquitoes whined. The Mustang groaned softly as the metal cooled. He kept his hands steady. He wore the same gloves he used for clutch work. His fingers smelled of oil. He opened the small parcel, a 6-inch length of piano wire, the kind used in instrument trusses, stiff and springy. He had filed a slight hook on one end and bent a tiny lip on the other. He had tested the wire on a scrap of detent material in the latrine 2 nights prior. It held and released and held again. It seemed foolproof in the shop. He could hardly sleep afterward. He worked with a pocket mirror to see the inside of the latch. The detent had a tiny ledge. He guided the hook of the wire to seat under that ledge without touching the release rod. His hands shook. The wire murmured as it slid into place. He cut the excess with wire cutters and tucked the ends into a small cavity. He filed the edges smooth so that maintenance would not see serrations. He hid the loop behind a plate. He smoothed grease over it. He stopped to listen. Somewhere in the distance a generator hummed. It took 8 minutes. It felt like an hour. Each small sound could have been a guard. Each creak a betrayer. He whispered the squadron prayer and slid fully out. He dry ran the release handle. The detent snapped clean. It moved with force. The piano wire had forced a sharp angle, guaranteeing a clean release rather than a hinge. He smiled once, quietly. The smile curdled into fear. If this failed, Hayes would crash and McKenna would be responsible. If this worked, men would live, and no one would know how. He thought of the telegrams again. He thought of family faces. He harnessed his nerves and wrote nothing down. He took the wire from his pocket and stowed the cutters back into his kit. He closed the access plate and walked away. The morning came with a sky like steel. McKenna watched from the hangar bay as Hayes taxied out. He was a man who had made a decision, and then had to trust someone else with his gamble. The prop wash was violent. The Mustang rolled and lifted. McKenna held his breath until Hayes was a dot. He went back to his toolbox and tried to act like a man who had nothing on his conscience. He greased landing gear and changed spark plugs. He checked nothing, but looked at everything. The point of no return was not a grand line. It was a small choice repeated in 1,000 private ways. McKenna had crossed it. He had hidden a small piece of wire in a machine built by committees. That night, the sky ate his fear. He had no choice but to wait. 7 hours. Hayes took off. The radio called the roll. McKenna watched time like a man checking a heartbeat. The mission was an escort to an island airstrip under attack. Target coordinates were briefed. A trading pier at 14 hours. The formation climbed in pairs. Engines screamed in clean harmony. The Mustangs cut the blue like knives. Formation details: 3 flights of 4 aircraft, 4 in trail, 2 out. Hayes flew number 2 in the second flight. His wingman was Sergeant Tom Doc Wilkins, 25, from Mobile, Alabama. Wilkins had a talent for calm radio chatter. They climbed to 16,000 feet. Clouds sat like broken glass below. At 08:02, the lead radio snapped. Visuals 9 o'clock low, bandits at 3,000. The voice was steady, professional. The formation banked. The sun glinted off aluminum. Pilots checked guns and instruments. The engagement started at 08:14 precisely, when the formation sighted a clutch of Japanese Zeros diving from altitude. The first contact was sudden. 9 Zeros, climbing in a loose V, sighted the Mustangs and dove. The enemy was fast in a turning fight. The Mustang pilots set throttles and prepared for slashing passes. They had fuel to spare, but none wanted to hang tanks during the first pass. Orders were to jettison at the brake. Hayes hesitated a beat. He tapped the toggle. The detent snapped. The tank fell away clean. That was the moment of truth. A Zero peeled to intercept Hayes. It dove with the killer grace of a trained pilot. The Mustang rolled hard. The control felt different. Hayes felt it almost immediately. The plane answered in a way that made his hands forget panic. He felt the control surfaces bite with a crispness he had not known on previous flights. That's when he felt it. The wingman later said over coffee in the mess. The airplane responded instantly. No lag, no hesitation. The modification worked. The characteristic drag that had killed men, the slow, sudden tug of a hanging tank, did not happen. Hayes could pull high G turns without the tailplane catching air in a new, dreadful way. He pulled inside the Zero's turn. The first shot missed. The Zero responded and dove away, but Hayes had the angle now. He rolled and chased. The sensation in the cockpit was immediate. G-forces pressed shoulders to harnesses. The sound was a living roar. Wind noise rose to a screaming whine. The sight of enemy aircraft grew as aluminum and paint and desperation. Hayes felt a new confidence. He pushed the stick forward, then back, then hard left. The Mustang conformed like a well-tuned violin. It changed direction, like it had been taught to move on command. The squadron radio crackled. "Hayes, you're on your own left," Wilkins said. Hayes fired a controlled burst. Tracer threads walked up the Zero's fuselage. The rounds found engine and tank. The Zero shuddered and rolled. Flames licked its belly. The enemy pilot tried to dive out, but the Mustang was already behind. The Zero broke into splinters of black smoke. Hayes watched it fall and felt both triumph and a hollow relief. First kill described with close detail. The Mustang rode the G's. Hayes's canopy fogged with sweat. He smelled burnt cordite. His hands were steady. The firing sequence was short. Squeeze, short burst, check, and re-squeeze. The rounds hit like a drum roll. The Zero's tail separated where the tracer marked the fuselage. Debris spread like confetti. Hayes' voice over the radio was low. "One bandit down," he said. The squad cheered in clipped phrases. There was no exultant laughter. There was a sober tally. He had never felt the plane obey so completely. He felt the modification in his fingertip. Yes, he thought of McKenna, crouched at the left wing on a humid night, and felt a private gratitude. Immediately more enemies dove. The engagement became a knot of metal and sound. Zeros attacked in pairs and trios. The Mustangs fought back. Hayes found himself in position again, and again, each time the Mustang snapping precisely where he wanted it. The modification had given him confidence to stay in the fight. He did not peel away to save fuel. He fought. The second engagement came as 3 Zeros split off to attack a straggling Corsair. Hayes rolled inward. He saw the lead Zero line up a deflection shot. Hayes pulled hard to his right and then reversed. The Mustang responded instantly. He got inside the enemy's turn. His guns barked. The Zero's cockpit disconnected in a sheet of flame. That enemy went down too. Between the first and second kills, Hayes radioed the briefest message. "Feels different up here." It was the kind of message that could mean many things. To the pilots who heard it, it meant one simple truth. Something had changed in the way the airplane handled. The third kill, if applicable, was decisive. The final Zero attempted to head toward the convoy. Hayes intercepted. He remembered the way the enemy pilot banked, and then overcompensated. The Mustang snapped into place behind the Zero. Hayes fired a long burst. The tracer lines were steady. The enemy plane rolled and dove. This time, there was no miraculous recovery. The Zero disintegrated in midair. The formation reassembled. Fuel gauges were checked. Pilots cursed and laughed and cursed again. The mission accomplished at 09:17 hours. The Mustangs returned to base at 09:46. The landing time was precise and prophetic. McKenna had watched the field for any sign of a black tumbleweed, any crackle of a radio that spelled death. When Hayes taxied in, McKenna ran hands trembling to the plane. Hayes climbed out. His face was white. His hands shook. He put them on McKenna's shoulders and looked at him. "It worked," he said. It was the simplest sentence, and it carried the weight of weeks. His voice trembled. "It worked." Mechanics swarmed the Mustang. They checked for damage and for the hidden wire. McKenna stood back. He watched Hayes speak to the maintenance chief. Hayes did not mention methods. He mentioned numbers. 3 enemy aircraft down, no loss. The mechanics compared notes. Someone asked about the Jettison. Hayes said simply, "Clean release." That was the truth. Inside the hangar, men hugged. They patted each other's shoulders. They drank. They smoked. They replayed the engagement with the speed of men who had come closer to the cliff and walked away. McKenna felt a rush of something he could not name. Vindication. Fear. Relief. He did not go to the celebration. He went to a corner and sat with his hands on the toolbox. He thought of the men who had died, and he cried once, low and quiet. The test had been brutal and beautiful and true. The modification had not produced miracles. It had produced control. It had given pilots the ability to muscle their planes in a way that matched human reflexes. For the first time in weeks, McKenna allowed Ed himself to believe that he had changed the balance of survival by one small, hidden gesture. Other pilots noticed. 6 other pilots had watched from altitude or had been in nearby fights. They returned and told their chiefs, Hayes' plane behaved different. The word spread in the blunt language of airfields. Different turned into better. Better turned into how. People asked around the edges. Mushier tongues added speculation. Maybe a fresh prop balance, or maybe he leaned mixture. No one dared suggest a mechanic's secret. Word spreads unofficially. Pilots began to request the same crisp control. "Can you make mine do that?" they asked Hayes. He shrugged and said, "I don't know. Maybe it's me." But he had seen the wire in the detent when he had a peek during an engine check. He had not mentioned it because rules are rules, but he knew McKenna had tinkered. Pilots started filing unofficial requests to the maintenance crew. "Make sure Jettison is clean." Mechanics passed notes. A few men with the right hands and the right conscience whispered to McKenna. McKenna became a reluctant node. He modified 9 aircraft by August 20th. He did them at night. He did them in pairs. He took his time to be sure each installation was neat. He showed a boldness in him. Few trusted men the trick in the privacy of a restroom. They practiced on scrap catches. It spread like a rumor because it worked, and because it was simple and invisible. Results multiplied. Modified planes returned with better combat reports. The squadron's kill-to-loss ratio improved. Pilots with modified Jettison catches began to fly more aggressively. Specific examples surfaced. Sergeant Tom Wilkins reported that his improved handling allowed him to cover a corsair that otherwise would have been lost on August 22nd. Pilot name Lieutenant Edward Eddie Miller, age 23, from Akron, Ohio. Miller later credited an anonymous mechanic with saving him after his corsair's drop tank tore a flap during a high-G turn. These were not grand claims. They were small, precise talk at the bar. By September, McKenna had modified planes up and down the line. He taught a few other tech sergeants who swore secrecy. Mechanics in other squadrons heard the rumor and started to test similar fixes. A network of field improvisation grew, an underground of grease and wire. No paperwork recorded it. No depot toolkit included a 6-inch piano wire in the Ahmad list. The spread was unofficial. It was human. It ran on trust and a kind of desperation. Pilots who had lost friends became evangelists. They would not stand for more telegrams. They did not have the time or patience for committees. They took matters into their own hands. The enemy noticed, too. Japanese pilots began to remark on the change. Intelligence reports, later translated and archived, showed confusion. Enemy radio intercepts logged phrases like, "something different in the air," and "their turning is sharper." The Zeros' tactics relied on predictable drag and yaw in certain engagements. When the Mustangs stopped giving the predictable snap, the attacks were less effective. Enemy pilots had to modify their approach. From the Japanese, perspective changes were subtle but dangerous. It took time for them to realize that American pilots were altering the way they fought. To a fighter pilot, small changes in handling are like changing the shape of a hunter's spear. The opponent takes seconds to adapt. In those seconds, lives are won or lost. Official discovery came the hard way. A maintenance inspection turned up an anomaly. A depot inspector, sent to audit the squadron in early September, found a neatly filed spot behind a release plate. He raised an eyebrow and checked his checklist. He asked the maintenance chief. Someone lied. The audit report flagged unauthorized field modification. Wing headquarters was notified. Initial fury followed. The wing commander called a meeting. The maintenance chief was summoned. McKenna was not present at the meeting. He kept working. The meeting involved phrases like discipline and chain of command. There was talk of setting an example. The engineers demanded an immediate inventory. The air of inevitability thickened. Then something odd happened. Pilots began to speak up. Hayes stepped forward and recounted the engagement. He described the clean release and the difference in handling. He did not reveal the method. He did not need to. He told the commanders what he had felt. Others corroborated. The list of improved engagements was more persuasive than a single stray wire. Engineering reports followed. Tests were run on the detent assembly. They attempted to recreate the hang. Under lab conditions, the part performed within tolerance. But in high-speed, high-stress field conditions, it failed to release cleanly in certain wear states. When engineers finally ran repeated high-speed drop tests, they recorded imprecise separations. They discovered that a small, positive mechanical bias, the sort of bias McKenna's wire supplied, eliminated marginal partial releases. At the end of that week, the command faced an impossible dilemma. They could punish the field for unauthorized modifications and risk grounded morale. Or they could quietly accept the modification and figure out how to institutionalize it. Moral clarity was less urgent than practical necessity. Lives were at stake. The wing's top brass chose the latter. The official line was cautious. The engineering team drafted a bulletin. Recommended improvement to jettison actuation under extreme conditions. They ordered a temporary inspection and then a design change to be adopted in future production. They framed it as a refinement rather than an admission of a fault. No single mechanic was named. Papers do not like names when blame and praise must be distributed. Unofficial acceptance trickled down. Mechanics found standard parts replaced with revised pins. Field manuals received an addendum about detent maintenance. The piano wire did not appear in any manual, but its effect had reshaped operations. Pilots flew with more confidence. Battles were fought differently. The underground mod had forced a bureaucracy to follow its nose to an obvious fix. Official evaluation came with cold steel and warm coffee. An engineering team flew in from headquarters. They conducted tests in controlled wind tunnels and on rigged aircraft. They measured forces and frictions. They recorded microseconds between and detent, release, and separation. Their conclusions were precise and embarrassing. The modification McKenna had used introduced a positive bias that ensured clean separation. The tests concluded. The modification was safe and effective, should have been part of the original design. Those words, once drafted, were filed in triplicate and routed through channels. The engineers recommended changes to the detent geometry and spring tension. They recommended the factory include a better radius in the hook and a stiffer plunger. They wrote that the original design did not account for tropical corrosion and repeated combat vibration. They phrased it politely, an oversight in environment-specific performance. Fleet-wide adoption followed quietly. The revised detent had made its way into future shipments. Depot manuals updated maintenance intervals. The bulletin recommended inspection of the catch and a suggested temporary field resiliency measure until replacement parts could be issued. No medals were given. No public announcement credited a single mechanic. The official record, in its thin bureaucratic tone, described a recommended refinement with no hero. McKenna's name did not appear in any engineering report. The men he had saved never filled out a citation form. The command could not pin a decoration to secrecy. They did not know who to reward because secrecy meant safety. Besides, awarding a sergeant for violating regulation posed a precedent the command did not relish. So they did what commands do. They sealed the story in logs and shuffled paper. Yet the improvement spread through the fleet regardless of paperwork. Pilots in other theaters reported fewer drop-induced accidents. The number of jettison-related losses dropped. Men who had lived to see their mothers again wrote home. Families that had been waiting for telegrams breathed easier. The quiet adoption saved lives in a way that no single ceremony could measure. What happened to the main characters varied like the weather. James McKenna survived the war. He flew home in civilian clothes and with hands that refused to stop finding bolts. He never told much. He worked as a machinist in a small factory. He married a schoolteacher from Cedar Rapids. He had 3 kids. He never spoke at reunions. When people asked about his war years, he would smile and say, "I was a mechanic." He kept a small slip of paper in his wallet with the names of the men who died and the dates. He visited memorials and left carnations. He never wanted praise. First Lieutenant Harold Hayes survived the war as well. He flew 63 missions and claimed 11 kills. He wrote letters home about the sky and about luck. He returned to Iowa and ran a trucking company. He called McKenna once a year for decades. The calls were short. "How's the shop?" "Good. How's life?" They never spoke of medals. When they did, Hayes would say, "You kept me alive, Jim." He would pause and sound like a man who knew he owed more than words. Some men did not survive. Corporal Jensen, Sergeant Alvarez, Lieutenant O'Rourke, and Sergeant Carter were buried in plots and on islands. Families received letters and sometimes the later, grudging reports that the plane's handling had been revised. No financial settlement followed. The war's ledger closed around their graves with its indifferent counting. Long-term impact was not a headline. It was an estimate. Historians later would attempt to measure the lives saved by the change. Between 80 and 100 American pilots, some argued, lived because the detent modification eliminated the worst of the drop-spin losses in specific theaters. Those numbers are never exact. Records are messy. But counting lives saved matters less than the pattern of human agency it reveals. Strategically, the effect was subtle. It did not win a single battle. It saved pilots who would fly other missions. It permitted more aggressive escort tactics. It made some commanders comfortable with fuller loads and longer ranges because the threat of a sudden drop spin had diminished. In crowded engagements, the margin of control meant one more pilot to fight another day. That is how small changes ripple outward. The engineers implemented a formal factory fix in late 1944. The new detent geometry and spring torque specifications appeared in blueprints. The manuals were updated. The bureaucratic language changed from within specification to performance within theater-specific conditions. People filed the changes and moved on. Yet no one at a high desk ever read McKenna's name aloud to a congressional committee. The medals went to fighter aces whose names sell. The quiet work of a sergeant in a dark field remained uncelebrated in official halls. James McKenna's later life was ordinary in the richest sense. He opened a small repair shop in Cedar Rapids. He taught apprentices how to file a thread and how to respect metal. He told a few stories about machines, never mentioning the wire. When people asked about the war, he would deflect. He called himself just a mechanic. On quiet Sundays, he would drive to a small cemetery plot where he had placed a marker for the men he could not forget. He read names aloud sometimes. He wrote to Hayes on each winter solstice. "Remember to replace your spark plugs," he would joke. Hayes would write back with a smudged signature. The historical rediscovery of the tale came decades later. A historian chasing telegrams and maintenance logs found a pile of letters in an estate sale. A faded toolbox held a slip of paper with names and dates. The historian tracked down survivors and families. He interviewed pilots and read engineering reports. The story emerged in a mid-sized article in a military history journal. Veterans groups circulated it. McKenna lived to see his work referenced in small print. He did not demand credit. He accepted a handshake at a reunion and a photograph. The historian estimated the impact and published a neat number, 80 lives saved, with footnotes and caveats. The principle the story shows matters more than the facts alone. Innovation often happens at the edges. It happens when a person with hands and a problem cannot wait for permission. It happens in the hush of night when bureaucracy sleeps and human life bleeds into a ledger. The change McKenna made was not about glory. It was about the stubborn insistence that a small improvement was worth the risk. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees and glowing reports in neat binders, not through slow-moving boards that argue semantics. It happens through sergeants and mechanics who see a problem, find a solution with the tools at hand, and act. They accept the risk of punishment in exchange for the chance of saving a man who might be someone's son. Final image: a black and white photograph of a young mechanic kneeling under the left wing of a Mustang. His face is lit by a dim lantern. There is grease on his cheek. His hands are steady. Around him, the world is chaotic. But in that picture, Everything points to one truth. Each life saved began with a pair of hands willing to break rules to keep a person breathing. If you found this story compelling, please like and subscribe to keep these tales alive. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and who you remember. Share the story with someone who respects the quiet work of those who keep planes in the air. Thank you for keeping these stories alive. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment with the name of someone you remember. These small acts keep memory in motion.